Now, one of these states was a state which can be called void. Some people, sophisticated people, talk about it as supracosmic and metacosmic void. Means it's emptiness that is supraordinated to everything and also in some sense underlies everything. You can find in Buddhist scriptures statements like form is emptiness and emptiness is form. So there's a state of mind that you can go into in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, which is a state of absolute metaphysical emptiness, nothingness. There's nothing there, yet it's conscious of itself. There's a point of consciousness that's aware of that emptiness. And there's paradoxically also the sense that there's nothing missing in that state. There's potential for all of existence, but none of it is concretized in any way. And you can link it to quantum physics. This is exactly what quantum physicists come to, talking about the dynamic void, talking about the probabilities, everything ultimately being just probabilities, but nothing is really manifested until it's observed, and so on. So that is one state where you have the feeling there is a sense of understanding where things come from. It's not understanding here, it's experiential understanding of the gut level. This is the source of existence. It comes from nothingness. Now this is tremendously important in understanding the psychology of Western cultures and in comparison, for example, to the Oriental cultures. We had a meeting in '85 in Kyoto, which was the International Transpersonal Association, and this was the time when there was tremendous conflict between Japan and the United States in business. You remember these difficulties? And they were having conferences trying to straighten it out. And there was a Jungian Japanese psychologist at the conference, Dr. Kawai, and he gave a talk on the differences between the Japanese mind and the Western mind in Jungian terms, in terms of the underlying archetypes, in terms of the underlying mythology. And he showed that the Oriental philosophy is a system with an empty center. Creation comes out of nothing. Creation comes out of emptiness. Our mythology, in the center is the power station. There is creative power. The creation comes out of the creative impulse. And then if you follow that, you get a totally different cosmology that has then reflection on the hierarchies in culture and so on. Whether you see the whole system as being self-supported, interconnected, or whether you see it as a system where you can have selective hierarchical control over things and so on, which is very much the Western psychology. So people who have powerful experiences of the void, they emerged basically with a new philosophy which is different from Western, and they feel a tremendous resonance with things like the I Ching, which expresses this kind of philosophy, the Taoist type of thinking. Now when you are in that state, you can also understand how something can come out of nothing, how creation can come out of emptiness. Again, this is something that is absolutely inconceivable for the left hemisphere thinking. You know, that we have a system in science where we believe everything is cause and effect. Only when you take it all the way back, and you're in trouble. Because then you have the question, what was the first cause, what was before the first cause, if there was a first mover, who moved that mover, and so on. And you see the absurdity of the system. Of course, science doesn't deal with it, or didn't deal with it until quantum physics, until people like Hawking and so on, talking about, again, creation out of nothing. If you read Hawking, Steve Hawking, he would say things like, nothingness has no other choice than to create existence. But you don't get very far with the cause and effect thinking, which we are dominated by in science and in our culture. That simply doesn't work. And we just draw a line there. We don't deal with that in science, and we play a game, we think we have it down, everything is very reasonable, and we sort of ignore that big hole. It's like the Sufi story, when a man goes and sees somebody under a lamp, sort of looking for something on the ground. He says, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for a key. He says, where did you lose it? He says, over there. He says, why are you looking for it here? He says, well, it's dark there, I wouldn't have a chance. So you have a very reasonable scientific system, only you don't deal with things where you wouldn't have a chance, like you don't ask questions. You just say, well, consciousness somehow comes out of matter, it comes from your brain. You don't ask the question, how does that happen? How can that kind of thing happen? Because you wouldn't have a chance. So you deal with those kinds of manifestations that make sense in your system. So you can talk about causes and effects, except when you go to the beginning. So that kind of thinking doesn't apply. We just will not deal with that stuff. So in the non-ordinary state, you get experiential sense how that can happen. You know, something comes out of nowhere. But you have to understand that you are also in a situation where you don't believe anymore that this is matter. This is solid stuff. This is solid Newtonian stuff. So you're not really, on that level, you're not dealing with the question, where does matter come from? You're dealing with the question of consciousness technology. How is the experience of matter created? And that's a whole other ballgame. We might be able to do it electronically 10 years from now. I mean, you can fool yourself with a hologram. You can fool yourself optically. You can create form. You can, with holophonic sound, you can sort of synchronize it with acoustics. You can have a talking person, holographic person, and your only remaining sense is touch in this kind of holography. You go there, and if you go through, it's a hologram. If something tells you you can't go any further, and you get a tactile sensation, it's a body there, it's a solid object. So, 10, 20 years from now, we can have something like holography that's going to do something to our touch, what Aldous Huxley called the feelies. You go to the movies, and you get a few electrodes, and you will not just see and hear, but when they're making love, you also start doing something to your pelvis, and at that point, there's no way of telling difference between technology of consciousness and reality. So anyway, when you go to the point of the void, you understand the creation, but not the creation of matter. You get the understanding of the creation of the illusion of the world. You get the kind of the Hollywood aspect of the divine play of Leela. How is that show created? What kind of technology goes into it? Now the first more tangible expression of the void, the first stage of creation, then is a different state of mind. And again, it's very difficult to describe in words. People usually complain not having words, not having language for it. But they will tell you something. And so when I studied those descriptions, when people talked about that state, it boiled down to basically three different things. One is, if you are in that state, you know that you exist. There is existence. There is consciousness, awareness, knowledge, and the state is blissful. There are no forms yet, there are nothing specific, nothing tangible. It's just a state of being in which you know you are conscious, and you know that you are experiencing your existence as being blissful. It's a state of overwhelming bliss. Now, if you go into Oriental scriptures, particularly into Sanskrit, you'll find the term for this. This is called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat means to exist or existence. Chit means sometimes translated as awareness, consciousness, and so on. And Ananda is bliss. So this is the supreme principle. This is the creative principle. This is out of which all this seems to come. And if you are in that state, you are experiencing it, you know that it's you. I mean, you have become that principle, so at that point you don't see it as something outside of yourself. And this is the message from the Upanishad, Tattvam Asi, thou art that. Now the way to think about it is that as you move through an altered state of consciousness, boundaries become illusory. I can become another person, I can become an elephant, I can become something 20 years ago. I can become the dancing Shiva. So, again, if you move out of our cognicentric state, where everything that you experience in non-ordinary state of consciousness doesn't count, you start questioning whether you are your body ego, because it's also based on your experience that you're a body. If you experience yourself in a very convinced way as not being a body or being another body, that is an interesting piece of information. And once you start taking those states as significant, you start redefining who you are. And if you had a few transpersonal experiences all the way to the Satchitananda principle, you realize that your identity is not fixed. You are the body ego, that's certainly one interesting, relevant aspect of it, but you are also the Satchitananda principle, and you're also anything in between and around it. Because you can experience boundaries of various kinds. If you experience yourself as an elephant, you also have boundaries, but those are boundaries of an elephant. So there are all kinds of things in which you create boundaries within an infinite continuum, but they're all relative. You can move through it, you realize that they are not mandatory. They're not absolute states. So your true identity then, if you take the message from non-ordinary states, is you are the totality of cosmic energy, or totality of consciousness, and within that, at different times, on different levels, you can experience yourself locked within systems that have boundaries, but those boundaries are not absolute. They feel very real, they feel very absolute at the time when it's happening, but it's all negotiable. You are not really ultimately bound by any of them. So this is the idea, we are all God, we are all the totality of cosmic energy, because none of us have boundaries. So it doesn't mean that, I am the divine, you are not. That awareness has little to do with the body ego. It's like a pyramid where there are a lot of stones here, and then on each higher level there are less and less stones, until at the top there is just one entity then. And on that level, because we are also that, on that level we are all one. On this level, obviously, the sense of separateness has some meaning. So this comes as this identification with Sat, Chit, Ananda, sort of infinite being, infinite awareness, knowledge, and infinite bliss. Then when people reach that state, then certain questions start emerging, particularly in those of us who are more inquisitive and curious than others. And that is, it's obvious to you that creation somehow comes from there. It's obvious that it's the cosmic furnace, the stuff that's throwing out the forms and creates the different levels of reality, different kinds of reality. Now the question comes, two questions. Why does that principle bother? Why does it create all those things? And the other one is, how does it do it? And again, a lot of people would come up with answers to those questions, and they're pretty similar. There are varieties, but they're pretty similar. So the question why does it create? First of all, that question why, in the way we experience it on this level, doesn't make that much sense there. What happens to you, you experience how that creation happened. You are that source, and then you experience the emergence out of form, out of that source, so you understand it on a gut level. You don't have an answer that would necessarily satisfy you on this level, but it's a state-bound answer which is experiential. Now, if some people try to describe it, they do something interesting, which I've seen earlier in many of the people who were labeled psychotic, and that is when they write something, it's going to be full of capital letters. It's love, but it's not love, it's love with capital L, and it's loneliness, but it's not just ordinary loneliness. It's not the kind of loneliness that you can experience, but something to do with it. It's loneliness with a capital L. So some people would tell you that source creates because of its incredible richness, because of its abundance. It's so overflowing with potential, it's so overflowing with creativity that it just has to give it out. On this level, the parallel would be an artist who has a lot of inspiration and would suffer tremendously if it just doesn't come out in some way. It simply has to do it. Another biological parallel would be a cell that will divide. At a certain point, you see there is churning and there are tensions, and then something starts happening, and before you know, there are two out of one. It comes out of inner tension that is an expression of that richness and creative potential, and also creative need. The source does not have a choice. It has to do it. It's part of its basic nature to do that. So some people say it's the inner richness. There are people who will say also it's also a loneliness. As fantastic as this state is, there's just one consciousness, and there is something like craving for partnership, to share, to have something to relate. And the creation then comes out of that need to have something different from oneself. Other people say love. This has something to do with love. It's a gesture of love. Other people emphasize more the aspect of experiment, that there is tremendous curiosity. What is possible? What happens if? What happens if there is a universe where something that in its very principle is a spiritual entity will suddenly start believing that it is a limited body and has these sort of it has 2 hands, 2 legs. It needs this substance called oxygen. Has to eat. What happens if there are going to be 2 of them in some kind of polarity, like male-female? What will happen if there is something like linear time and there is evolution, and at different times people will wear different costumes and so on? There is an experimentation happening. There's research happening. There is exploration happening. There's an extreme statement which some people made, and which is actually the same as you find in the Kabbalah, which is the principle creates out of boredom. As beautiful as it is, it's monotonous, too much of the same, and there is a need for change. You find this, again, artistic expression of it in Wagner's Tannhäuser, when Tannhäuser, who was the troubadour, the Minnesänger, ends up in Venusberg, which is the Venus mountain. It's a mountain with a hollow inside, inhabited by nymphs and satyrs and the most exquisite orgies happening, and the goddess of love. And he spent several years there, and then after this he starts craving trivia. You see, so wants to go back, and it wouldn't be bad to suffer a little. And then he finally sort of utters the name of Maria, and the mountain opens, and he's out back to the world, which is a mixed bag from this place where there is only rapture and ecstasy. And so that's creation out of boredom. Now then, the other question that people are asking is, how does it happen? What is the technology of consciousness? How are realities created out of consciousness? The answer that most people do give involves 2 principles that sort of cooperate with each other. One is it happens by the method of divisions. Something that is undivided, that is one, splits somehow and becomes many. The second process that goes hand in hand is something like partitioning, or some people say cosmic screen work. That means these split units of consciousness experience themselves as separate from each other and separate from the source from which they came. So somehow the element of self-deception and false sort of an illusion of separateness comes. A certain screen work, partitioning comes. Now you can't think about this as in terms of masonry. In technology of consciousness, this is more like forgetting. You see, that would be a much, much better metaphor. Alan Watts wrote a book which is called A Book About the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. This is the idea of forgetting who we are, partitioning, screen work, and so on. Well, we can say that through these 2 mechanisms, then these different levels of realities are created. One of them is the archetypal. There are sort of other kinds of worlds, universes. One of these sort of holographic channels, if you want, in the world of consciousness would be what we know as phenomenal reality. Ultimately, it would not be any more real or less real than the world of the Great Mother Goddess. In electronic technology, there are different channels. Sumerian underworld is channel 26, and you can spend some time there. You know, this is channel 3. And you can be there and you can believe that there is only channel 3 until somebody pushes the button and you switch to channel 6. But when we are here, we like to believe that this is the only one that is real and the others are some kind of derivatives of this one. Those other receptions are not real. But if you look into it, in deep non-ordinary states, you'll find out it's all created by the same technology. The fact that this looks more solid and so on, or more predictable, this produces trick in that understanding. Like if you have a movie and you have a producer that controls filmmaking, he can take you on any kind of trip. You see, it makes it sort of nice and solid and clear, and when you're looking at it, you say, now this is an episode of real life. And then you see the guy going to bed, and then the images sort of become black and white, and then it becomes a little blurred and sort of a little more fleeting. You say, the hero's dreaming. And then you see somebody taking a pill, and then the colors become very vivid, and some kind of strange distortions, and you say, the guy's tripping. But on the Hollywood level, all it takes is one kind of technology. Those are tricks. You use different kind of experiential qualities for different experiences, and you can create different worlds, different nuances. So again, in something like Vipassana meditation, where you analyze perception, or in something like non-ordinary states, you can sort of see through it. It would be like up to this point, you were just watching the movie screen, and you thought all there was out there, and you couldn't figure it out. There were problems, like, in some movies there were flying saucers, in other, it was like Bambi, animals were talking, and you couldn't sort of get it quite together how it all is one reality. And one tremendous thing in Kashmir Shaivism will tell you, don't do that, that's waste of time. Stay in the ordinary state of consciousness and collecting information and trying to make sense out of it, because what you are experiencing is part of the story. This is the same thing that David Bohm, who's a co-worker of Einstein's, he's saying these days about science. Don't have the illusion that science is telling you anything about what the universe is like. Historical periods are art forms of the collective unconscious. So with Middle Ages comes medieval science, with 20th century comes 20th century science. They are not studying the same universe in different ways, more or less developed. This belongs, science and the forms of religion belongs to the art form of a particular time. There's no way scientists can step out of the show, because whatever they are doing is part of the story on the screen. So in Kashmir Shaivism would be, as long as you want entertainment, you watch out there. If you are interested what it is about, this is not out there, you have to turn, and then you find out that there is some kind of source of light, there is some kind of celluloid, there's something is throwing pictures. Then you can ask, what is there a level behind it? And then you find out Hollywood, then you find somebody had a screenplay, somebody wanted you to have a certain kind of experience. And that is the explanation for why you are experiencing what you are experiencing. Things which are out there are not causally related at all. They wanted you to believe that they are causally related. If you see a Western, and there is a cowboy shooting and an Indian falling off the horse, you make a connection in your head, say, the guy fell off the horse because the other guy shot him. Right? Wrong. The guy fell off the horse because they wanted you to believe that the guy was shot. And they also orchestrated some other kinds of things. They made a hole and something was dripping out of the hole. What is the reason why the guy fell off the horse? It's in the screenplay. It's because somebody was giving you an art form which involved a certain kind of experience, and it has to be nicely orchestrated, put together, so you can read into it causal connections. Now you can have states of mind when you will see that this is not any different. The reason why things happen in a certain way is because there is a certain higher order screenplay, and all the elements in what we are experiencing are governed by that. So whatever you are discovering in this level, you are part of the script. You are not stepping out of the script and making any kind of objective judgments about the script. I'm not saying this is so. Do you understand what I'm reporting? How people see the universe in non-ordinary states. And you can bring a good argument for this. I mean, it's, in a sense, it's better than the one that we live with, because it covers much more information. It is a conceptualization for a much wider range of observations and experiences, and also it takes into consideration not just ordinary consciousness, but things that happen in other states of consciousness. Okay, now there's another question that people frequently ask, and that's a very interesting one, and that is, why is evil in the world? I mean, some of those experiences are experiences that we don't particularly like. And that's true for the non-ordinary states as much as it is true for our everyday life. There are things that we enjoy. There are other things that we could live without. There are other things that we really don't want as part of our life. So people ask very serious questions. You know, what is evil? Why is evil in the world? They asked this question Ramakrishna. He says, Swamiji, why is evil in the world? And he sort of thought about it for a while, and he said, to thicken the plot. Now, since we are talking about the movies, you imagine that we would take out of our world everything that we think shouldn't be there. Everything's bad, unpleasant, evil. So certainly we don't want to be sick. So let's take out diseases. Nobody has any kind of problem. We are all ideally healthy. And we do it with all of human history. Now you can't do this in an isolated fashion. You take out diseases. Now here goes the history of medicine. We don't have any heroes. We don't have any Virchow's. We don't have any Pasteurs. We don't have the discovery, the exciting discovery of penicillin. Here goes Mother Teresa. There's no place for Mother Teresa. You don't have evil. You don't need church. You see, you do it a few times, take out a few things that we think shouldn't be there. You end up with a plot that is so flat that if somebody would make it to a movie, we wouldn't bother to go and watch it. I mean, think about the movies that fall in that category. They are not the movies that fill the movie theaters. So, you see, we want something, very deep essence in us wants all that whole range of experiences. You know, people go to movies where you explore just incredible dimensions of beings which you wouldn't possibly dream about experiencing if they were real. The possibility to experience it is because you know it is as if. You can put yourself in a state where you're actually experiencing it, but you can also, if it gets too heavy, you can step back and say, what am I doing? This is just a movie. But you go there, you want it anyway. So this idea is that the cosmic artist, if you want, the creative consciousness, it will also tend to enact all kinds of possibilities. Now, in the concrete sense, then people ask the questions about evil, and they very frequently find out that in order to create out of itself, the cosmic principle has to negate itself. So the first step in the process of creation would be something like a negative mirror image of the Satchitananda. Now, if you think about it, what we consider bad, evil, painful, unpleasant fits into three major categories, and each of them is a negation of one of the aspects of the creative principle. The first part of it is Sat, which is being, existence, infinite being. It's not one nice category of evil, bad things which have to do with non-existence, not being, or limited existence. The fact that we don't live forever, we age, we die, we can lose our life. Those are things that have to do with negation of existence. The second one is Chit, which is awareness, knowledge. So that category is limited awareness or ignorance. And then the most obvious category is the negation of Ananda, of bliss, which would be the whole spectrum of pain, unpleasant, negative emotions, physical pain, difficult experiences, and so on. So we would have this negative image of the Satchitananda and the negation of it, and then in the overall cosmic scheme where you have partitioning and you have divisions, you will find out that what we call evil, what we call bad, is actually identical with the partitioning principle. It is the principle that makes us feel separate from each other and separate from the source, that keeps us in oblivion of who we really are. Our essence is we are spiritual beings that have infinite existence. And then a lot of what we call suffering, all of it actually, comes from the fact that we are not aware of that, we are not in touch with that reality. In other words, if we knew that this is not as real as we think it is, we would have a very different freedom in experiencing the whole range. If I really were convinced that death is not real, you know, that would make a tremendous difference in my life. If I really believe that death is like giving up your old Chevrolet and buy a new car or put on a different trench coat, you know, we would have a very different opinion about other things. There would be many things that we would be doing, other things we wouldn't be doing, and so on. So it comes from the belief that we have limited existence, that we are really body egos, we are subjected to all these laws, secular laws, is a source of a lot of suffering in life. Now, another question that people would be asking now, given the fact that we have something like the creative source, the void, the Satchitananda, we have the certain transcendental need to create of the creative principle, we have something about the mechanics that involves the divisions and the partitioning, and the whole thing is somehow serving the purpose of this fantastic adventure in consciousness, this adventure, this experiment, this divine play, lila as the Hindus call it, which accounts for fantastic adventurous possibilities on different levels. Then the question is, how does it happen that I buy a certain self-image that is false? How is it possible that if I am an unlimited spiritual being, I am sort of tricked into understanding or to believing that I am a Newtonian object, that I am a solid body, that I need to eat, that I need oxygen? Now the best answer that I have heard so far, and it also was confirmed by some of my own experiences, is the following. The whole universe is like this fantastic adventure in consciousness, this incredible cosmic dance. It's a play, it's a piece of art, among others. If you look again at the parallel on the human level with art, a good art will almost replace reality. If you see a good theater play and good performance of actors, or a good movie, you might forget you're in the movies and you really get yourself into it. And if it's a good love story, you know, you might experience sexual arousal, and if it's Exorcist, some people will throw up and they can't stand it and they get out of there as if something was really happening there. So if something is really done with powerful means, it can substitute reality, it can sort of pass for reality. So there is a certain degree of perfection that would be mimicking reality. Now the source that we are talking about has intelligence and creativity and capacity which is unimaginable on the level to which we are reduced. I mean, this would be like Chopin playing the piano and then reducing himself to a cockroach and then let himself be admired sort of by or a gopher watching mathematicians solving differential equations. I mean, it's that kind of relationship between the intelligence that is available in everyday life and the intelligence that created this. So it has incredible capacity to create an art form where everything is accounted for. All the loopholes are covered in such a way that the principle traps itself with its own perfection. I mean, it creates a show which is so believable that it traps itself. I will give you an example of Baltimore, because one of the persons who experienced this gave that example. Now, if you add to this something like square miles of ugly houses red and black, uninteresting. In Baltimore, people living their sort of trivial lives, snoring and farting and sweating and so on. It takes some analysis, and you have to go to some other levels to realize that this comes from a perfect source. So, unless you realize that that was the very purpose, was to create a believable system that would pass for trivial, ordinary, mundane, material reality. Aurobindo has this his extreme statement about the atheist. The atheist is God playing hide and seek with himself. So the atheist would be like the extreme trick of the creative principle. It created something that tries to believably deny itself, and so on. But there are some more subtle tricks, like those, the suburbs in Baltimore. So you can substitute anything you want to for that, but I'm sure you find lots of examples. Now, in non-ordinary states of consciousness, you can see through that. You can see the absolute perfection in the trivial, in the mundane, and you can see that it's a necessary part of the creation. So there's absolutely no hierarchy of values, aesthetic or any others. If you take something like kitsch, from your human level, you might be very snobbish about it. I mean, it's a really low-level kind of stuff. As long as that person who did it was trying to be like Michelangelo. As long as this was created from a place where it was meant to be kitsch, it's exactly the kinds of emotional reactions that it's going to do. It's a piece of perfection. Do you know what I'm saying? A toad is a toad, and it fits exactly the place it's supposed to fit. It creates an aesthetic impact on us, which is what was meant to mean. So, again, back to the movies. There are movies where people want to create an atmosphere of horror or extreme ugliness. It's experimenting with states of consciousness and so on. So from that point of view, there are absolutely no hierarchies. Chimpanzee is just as good as Einstein. I mean, chimpanzee is God, which is sort of perfectly incarnate in a chimpanzee. It was meant to be a chimpanzee. Einstein is the same principle that created what was supposed to be Einstein. So once you have this kind of meta-framework, Einstein is no better than a chimpanzee. The chimpanzee is perfect for what it was supposed to be as much as a scientist is. I even have a very strong feeling that this applies, for example, to animals, that the whole idea that their limitations come from their brain capacities, whether they have ganglia or whether they have a brain or how big a brain it is, I really don't believe that this is a relevant way of thinking about it. I believe that each form has a piece of the absolute cosmic intelligence that it's supposed to have for that particular form. So you have these miraculous things of navigation of birds and so on, and we're trying to put it into their brains and explain it in some kind of natural ways, and we don't have a lot of success. One situation that hit me in a very, very hard way was we had a house in Big Sur, and we had a roof that was overlapping, we had a deck with a railing, and we had a hibachi grill standing there. And one morning I came out to look at the ocean, and there was this most beautiful large spider web, and it was anchored, parts of it were anchored on the railing, parts of it on the hibachi, parts of it were coming from the overlapping roof. Now this kind of thing cannot be done with a few ganglia. I mean, that creature had to have a three-dimensional idea, had limitations. I mean, it couldn't fly, it had to travel in its own way. But you see, to get from this place to that one, it had to go down from the hibachi, go crawl up, go this way, that way, fix it in the right place, and had to have a sense of a geometric of the mandala that it was creating. It was creating it from the limitations of the spider. But the idea that you could explain that from that nervous system which was there is just not a very believable theory anymore. So there's a possibility that each creation, each creature is sharing just the right piece, just the right form of absolute cosmic intelligence. It is good for what it is. So we have now this system where we have the creative source, we have these different levels inhabited by entities that are actually split units of consciousness that have forgotten where they came from. They forgot that they are part with everything else. They experience themselves as separate. And this provides the possibility of this fantastic cosmic dance on different levels, the dramas. And there's a tendency in this system to experiment with whatever can be experimented with. Again, we have our own human ideas about it, what is appropriate, what should be there, what shouldn't be there. You know, the kinds of things we did around sexuality, whether you can be homosexual or you should be heterosexual, you should have one wife or you could have 15 wives, and you know, what degree of intimacy can you have with your brother and sister? Well, that's true for a certain culture. That's not true for the creative principle. That is interested what kind of experience it is if two persons of the same sex interest, how does it differ from when it is people from the same sex? What does it feel like when you put this end to that end, and what does it, what does it feel like? What experiential possibilities there are if you turn it around? If you take a culture like New Caledonia, they kill fraternal twins if they were male and female because they committed incest in the womb. You go to Peru or you go to Egypt, and within the Pharaoh family or the Inca family, the brother has to marry the sister, otherwise it's a scandal. You know, you have cultures where monogamy is such that something else would be punished by death. You have cultures where there is polygamy. You have cultures where there is polyandry. You have cultures where they feel perfectly comfortable being nude. You have others where you show your nose and you get killed for that because you should have your face covered. I mean, these are all trips. I mean, we are programmed into taking this, absolutely, we are ethnocentric. Each culture has an idea what is acceptable, what is right, what isn't right. But once in non-ordinary states you get an overview, and those are all plays. I mean, it's like watching different movies. You know, it's appropriate if you live in a certain culture to play it by the rules. But you can also have another dimension where you have a degree of freedom, where you just see all those are relative things. You don't get caught into those games where people get excited and fighting about these issues and so on. Now, the other thing that people discover within this system, this is just one half of it, going from one to many, from the void or from Satchitananda to a level like this, when you have a lot of separate entities. Some are male, some are female, some are black, some are yellow, some are white. You know, some live in one century, others live in another century. Some of them are human, some of them are animals, and so on. And then all these sort of interactions. And then the idea is that within the same system, there are also built-in mechanisms through which you can escape the sense of separation and being sort of committed to a particular partial form, and you get a way out into, in non-ordinary states of consciousness. You can sort of dissolve these boundaries, and you can start the journey back when you somehow rediscover your own true identity, which you lost contact with. So those are ways to reunion. So there are like two movements, dynamics, the coexisting in the system that we are. One goes from the source to separation, to divisions. The other one is from separation back to unity. Now comes catch-22. In many of the religious systems, you will find out that they would consider this level to be kind of the low level. This is the garbage level. This is the quagmire of death, rebirth. This is the valley of tears. And you want out. I mean, the last thing you want to do is to stay here. So you want out of the cycle of death, rebirth. You want to nirvana. So this is the original, for example, Hinayana Buddhism, where the idea was you want to extinguish the torch of life. You want to get beyond the thirst of flesh and blood. You want to be in nirvana. And nirvana means literally evanescence. You want to fade out of existence. It's too much trouble. It's all associated with suffering. The Jainist religion has the same kind of thing. You are jiva, you're sort of crystalline, pure entity, monad of life, and you are entangled, contaminated by your association with the biological way of existence. You want to purify that, and you want to move into this sort of pristine state beyond incarnation, beyond existence. Now, people who had that experience of union with God, back to the source, realize that there is a problem, because that's where creation came from in the first place. So if that state were so satisfying, so self-fulfilling, none of these other things would be here. The principle would simply stay where it is, wouldn't bother to do these other things. So that there's a discovery that there is no way that principle can not to create. It is a fundamental, transcendental need of that state to create out of itself. So now what is the solution? The solution here, according to the insights that people get when they get to those levels, is that the level of the phenomenal world and the transcendental level of the Satchitananda, those are two complementary realities. They somehow need each other. You find in some of the spiritual literature is that people need God, but God also needs people. Or in some of the aboriginal religions, you see God's created humanity for a particular purpose. So there's a kind of symbiosis. There's an interaction, dynamics. There's a dialectic dialogue sort of happening. The solution then would be to be here, fully here, sort of incarnate, to be in the world, to be in the phenomenal world. This is the solution which was also found in the Mahayana Buddhism, where the nirvana is not evanescence, it's not going out of here, but it's to eliminate certain forces within this incarnation that makes existence tolerable or even exciting. And the three forces are represented by a pig, by a rooster, and by a snake. Those forces are anger, aggression, desire, lust, and ignorance. So if you can eliminate some, if you can inner transformation overcome or diminish those three forces within yourself, then you can be in the phenomenal world incarnate, and at the same time you don't experience profound suffering. Or if you go through something unpleasant, you have this metta framework to which you can sort of relate it. So the idea is that this level has something to offer, a certain experiential possibilities that the undifferentiated cosmic state does not have. It has it in a potential form, but not concretized. Only on this level can you have a child. Only on this level can you listen to Beethoven, or go windsurfing, or go hiking, or eat bouillabaisse, or whatever your thing is, whatever you enjoy. So this level has something to offer, but to be totally identified just with this, in other words, to lose the awareness that it's a play and take it, to buy it, sort of be a real sucker for the, to believe that this is all there is, means to getting lost in the play, to be like in the movies and believing that what's happening is there, rather than believing that it's this play of vibrations, of shadows and lights and so on. So the idea would be to be here, experience whatever is part of the experience, but have also this other level, this sort of meta level, the sense of one's true identity. It would be like Olivier, playing Othello or whatever it is, Hamlet, and being fully involved in it and really be part of the play, but somewhere in the back of the head there is also the knowledge that you are not really a murderer, that you are Laurence Olivier and so on. Sometimes people give also this parallel with, how do we understand our role? It's the question of free will and determinism. When you go to, or used to go to S training, I don't know where Werner is now, the final message was, you're God, you created your own universe. And there was a peculiar kind of confusion. It was like, me, Stan, you see, as you see here, I created the universe. Now, I know that's not true. What seems to be true, at least in non-ordinary states, is all of us created what is here, but not from where we sit now, but from the top of the pyramid. In other words, the fact is that what we are playing now is certain roles in a screenplay which was written by all of us when we were still one entity. So the idea would be like Shakespeare has a concept of a play, let's say Hamlet, at the beginning all the characters are just thought forms within one mind, then to make it a really good show, you need separate entities. I mean, if they're not real separate individuals, nobody gets killed, nobody can love and hate anybody else, so you wouldn't have a real story. So for that purpose, you need separate entities, you need real characters. And what can happen is that theoretically Shakespeare could write the play and cast himself as Hamlet. Now, from the level from which he was writing the play, he had a different degree of free will than from the level from when you are cast into a role, because there it's pretty much determined. And the problem here, the free will and determination and so on, comes from what Gregory Bateson would call an error in typing. That means the Shakespeare who wrote the play is not the same Shakespeare who is in the cast. There's no absolute conflict between free will and determinism. Depends on with which level we identify. Are we really aware of our true identity, or are we identifying with the actor? Are we identifying with the protagonist? Now, how does this relate to what we're doing, the holotropic breathing? How does it relate to what we call psychopathology? Traditionally, what we call psychopathology. Now, up to this point, Western science has been exploring a certain image of human beings as being Newtonian objects, solid entities, skin-encapsulated egos, if you want, complex biological machines, thinking machines, highly developed animals. This is the image that we got in the medical school. And in this context, consciousness is seen as a product of the brain. Some of the extreme forms of materialism, like what is now called vulgar materialism, you can find statements like, there's nothing special about consciousness. Consciousness is just an organic physiological function. The brain produces consciousness like the kidneys produce urine. So this is the extreme of the medical model. I mean, the consciousness somehow comes as an epiphenomenon. It has to do with the complexity of the neurophysiological processes. Now you have people like Penfield, who's one of the founders of neurosurgery, brain research. He died, and just before his death he wrote a book called The Mystery of Mind. And in a nutshell, his conclusion was, as far as he's concerned, consciousness cannot possibly come out of the brain. I mean, there's some kind of parallelism happening between the neurophysiological processes and consciousness, but the idea that the whole thing is happening inside of your skull just didn't make it for him after decades of really systematic daily research on neurosurgery, neurophysiology, and so on. But this is the image of human beings that we have. Now, what's coming now from modern consciousness research, from psychedelic research, from the breathing and other experiential psychotherapies and so on, from near-death experiences, from thanatology, from some of the more enlightened anthropologists who work with shamans and so on, and call themselves visionary anthropologists, who actually participate in rituals rather than sitting on the tree with a writing pad and sort of observing what the natives are doing. We have now powerful confirmation coming from these modern developments in science that confirm now quite systematically another image of human beings that has been around for centuries or millennia as part of the so-called perennial philosophy. And that is the image that our true nature is we are consciousness. And physical reality comes from consciousness. I don't know if you ever thought about, again, another major problem that we have in science, and that is that if the world is really material, we'll never know it. It is not testable. It is not something that's accessible with our limitations, that's accessible in principle to scientific investigation. We are fooling ourselves thinking that sciences are studying the material universe. Astronomy is not a science about stars. The astronomy is a science of human experiences of what we call stars. Mineralogy is not a science about stones. Mineralogy is a science about human experiences with what we call stones. and it deals also with things like colors and so on, which we know are not around. Even physical terms, what we call colors is a perception of different levels of frequencies. There's nothing around like colors. This is a purely subjective term. And there's no way of getting beyond that, because whatever we experience is a human experience. This is the old Kantian problem between phenomena and Noumena, or so-called things in themselves, Dinge an sich. If I'm perceiving Jim, what I'm supposedly doing, something in me, this is not defined in science what it is interpreting biochemical changes in my cortex, which were created by light bouncing off what I perceive as Jim, exciting my retina, translated into a neuron impulse, and ultimately doing some biochemical changes in my cortex. And something in me reads that, works with it. As a result of this process, I come up with something that even remotely resembles what is really out there. Is not a very convincing hypothesis. Okay. So we have this fact that if the world is material, we'll never know it, because all we know is our experience of the world. I don't even know if I'm experiencing the way you are, if what is green for you is also green for me. But we somehow agree, by and large, with some minor friction problems and so on, we agree on certain things. This is a chair, it's there, and so on. But we know that it cannot possibly be accurate reflection of something objective that we all are experiencing. There are tremendous varieties or differences in how we experience different things. So there is this other notion now coming: we are fields of consciousness, transcending time and space, having no limitations, transcending linear causality. You can experience it in meditation, you can experience it in spiritual emergencies, you can experience it in the breathing, you can experience it under hypnosis, in the trance state, you can experience it when you take psychedelic sessions and so on. So what we have to do now, because we know those things are real, a person can be dying and consciousness detaches from the brain and they would go and perceive something in the other part of the building. Blind people can see in an out-of-body state and so on. So what we end up with is some kind of strange paradox, a paradoxical definition of who we are, and that definition will be very strangely similar to what physicists like Fred Wolf came up with in relation to subatomic matter and also light, and that is the wave-particle paradox. Subatomic matter is particles and waves at the same time. Light is photons or electromagnetic waves. In different experimental arrangements and the different circumstances, sometimes it's more appropriate to think about what you're seeing as photons. In some other experiments, it's more like light. And Niels Bohr, who tried to solve this paradox, came up with what's called Complementarity Principle. In order to understand what light is, what subatomic matter is, you have to simply accept a paradox. Those are two complementary aspects of the same phenomenon. And you, no matter what you do, you will not get what Einstein always wanted, which is a visualizable model. You can really pin it down. Say, what is it? I mean, a particle is occupying a certain space, has a certain momentum, has certain coordinates. Waves are spread all over the place. So, and your brain is saying, is it a particle or is it a wave? It cannot be both. Only this is the best we can do. We can say those are two complementary aspects. Sometimes, under certain circumstances, we see more of the one. Sometimes we see more of the other. Now, we can do something like this on the level of consciousness research and sciences that study human beings. We can say a human being is a Newtonian object. It is a biological machine. And it is also an infinite field of consciousness, transcending time, space, and linear causality. Those are two complementary aspects of who we are. They manifest under different circumstances. And to really have some comprehension who we are, you have to accept those two with the paradox that's involved and with a sense of complementarity. Under certain circumstances, which means in what I call the hamburger stand rush hour consciousness, it will be more appropriate to think about yourself as a body. You have a skin, you inhabit your skin, you have certain limitations and so on. In non-ordinary states of consciousness, that self-definition is not appropriate. You will find out that you don't have those boundaries are not absolute, you might not experience yourself as solid, you break down into all kinds of energy fields, you find out that you can be the person over there, you can be an animal, you can become the dancing Shiva and so on. So you have a very different sense of identity. So those are two complementary aspects of who we are, and each of them has a kind of mode of consciousness that's associated with it. So we have one aspect of ourselves, which is the Newtonian biological thinking machine. Let's call that C, consciousness. Let's give it a name. Let's call it holotropic. So I give it a little index here. Holotropic. Hyle in Greek means matter. Trapein means oriented towards. Heliotropism is the property of the plant of moving towards the sun. Heliotropic. So holotropic means matter-oriented, moving towards matter. So in the terms of the cosmology that I was talking about, that's a movement from the void and the Satchitananda into incarnation, into the world of matter, into the world of phenomenal manifestation. So we call it holotropic. And these experiences in this state of consciousness will systematically confirm that you are body ego, that you are skin encapsulated ego, that you live in a Newtonian world where objects are solid, two objects cannot occupy the same space. Space is three-dimensional, time is linear, everything is cause and effect, and so on. And if you don't leave that state, this is what it's going to be for you. You might believe that that's really the way it is. You can go into deep meditation, into hypnosis, into the breathing, into psychedelic states, into spiritual emergency. And suddenly this is not true. You are in a state that we can call holotropic. Holos means whole, and trapein against means moving towards. So this means moving towards totality, moving towards wholeness. So in the cosmology it would be a movement from separate identity back towards undifferentiated unity, melting of boundaries, experiencing bigger and bigger wholes, and so on. So we are some kind of dynamic, we are a stage in which these two movements are in constant sort of dialectic interchange. We mentioned before that the undifferentiated cosmic consciousness wants to incarnate, wants to become many, and when we end up on the other side, it's too much of a hassle, too much of a pain, and something in us wants to go back. We have the need to transcend. So these experiences in the holotropic consciousness would systematically confirm, if you have enough of them, you are not solid, you are a system of energy. You can go beyond that, you find out that the world is just an orchestration of experiences, or if it isn't, that's all you can say about it, as I mentioned before. This is one of the major exercises in Vipassana meditation, that you sit and you analyze your experience of the world. And all you know is there are visual experiences, there are acoustic experiences, there are tactile experiences, pains and so on. And you make, out of it, you make the image of the material world. But all we have is experiences. But like in the movies, when I was talking about the cowboy or the Indian falling of the horse, they are orchestrated in such a way that they give appearance of causing each other. Now, if this is true, if we have these two aspects and these two corresponding states of consciousness, none of them is pathological. They're two complementary aspects. A physicist would not call light that manifests as waves a psychotic photon. It would say a sick photon. It would say, at this point in this particular experimental arrangement, light is showing its wave aspect. In another arrangement, it will show its particle aspect. But both of those are legitimate aspects of the system that we are working with. So there's nothing pathological about having holotropic type of experiences. It can be bad if it's happening in the wrong context, like that Albuquerque airport. That's not the place to exercise your holotropic aspects. You want to know that you're in the right place when it is happening. But if you are in the right place, it can be extremely educative, it can be healing, it can be transformative. There's nothing essentially pathological about it. So the idea would be, if it is true that we have these two aspects, to accept them, to cultivate those aspects, to complement what you're doing in everyday life with meditation, with participation in rituals, in experiential psychotherapy, whatever. You want to know that, you want to honor that aspect. Each of those forms is good for something and bad for something else. As I mentioned the other day, if you are a pilot landing a 747 in Kennedy Airport, and you want to be in the holotropic mode. That's not the time to find out that you were an embalmer in ancient Egypt 2,000 years ago. At that time, you're also not interested what it feels like when an elephant gets a peanut into his trunk. It's not also time to have an out-of-body experience and sort of float around the Empire State Building. You want to also know that the runway is solid, that you can rely on it, that you can trust the time-space coordinates, which are also coordinated with some of the other happenings around you and so on. You really want to be in the holotropic mode. Now, if you stay in that, if you never leave it, which is the ideal of normalcy in Western culture, the best psychiatrist should be one who has never had any holotropic states, maybe with the exception of some dreams. You know, we hide it from each other in staff meetings that we ever had those experiences, because that would disqualify us. You know, a professional, you know, should never have that. He just treats the other poor things who happen to have these kinds of experiences, and what makes you expert is that you never experience, so you don't really know what they are going through. Which is different from the shamanic. The idea in the shamanic, or the idea of a guru in India, is you go to somebody who has been through what you are now going through, and they got through it to the other side, so they can tell you from their own experience what is happening to you. To go in a holotropic state of consciousness to somebody who has never left the holotropic mode, I don't care what degrees they have, I don't care what books they have read, is like having sexual problems and going to a pre-adolescent, you know, discussing orgasm. And this is the whole idea, you know, to use for work in certain mental health facilities and so on, for working with people who are in psychotic states, somebody who has been there before, so that person can help from a very different place, or recovering people helping others in 12-step programs and so on, have a very different possibility of understanding and treating than those who have never ever faced that problem. This is alien to the Western type of thinking. So the idea would be then cultivate those two states and be able to find right circumstances in which you have one or the other mode of consciousness. If you want to heal yourself, you want to heal others, I'm not talking about body mechanics, I'm talking about healing others, you want to do it in a holotropic state of consciousness. You don't want to do it in this state of consciousness. If you want to tap deep sources of creativity, the major creative inspirations, inventions, if you read the history of creativity, always came from holotropic state. The person might have spent 5 years researching, studying, experimenting, but the real solution came then when they were waking up from a dream, or like Heisenberg when he was sick with hay fever so he couldn't see. That's where he got the ideas about quantum physics. The idea for an experiment that meant the discovery of adrenaline and the Nobel Prize came in a dream, and so on. We know the story of organic physics, the story of discovery of benzene that came again in a vision to Kekule when he saw an Ouroboros, and he got the idea how the carbon atoms might be linked in the ring. So just the last thing here, there is an interface here that you want to stay away from. And that is when you are experiencing these two at the same time. In other words, you are in a context where you're supposed to be holotropic, but you happen to have holotropic experiences. And then you have an enclave in your everyday life that we call psychopathology. You get an asthmatic attack here, nobody's choking you, and you cannot breathe, which is an alien enclave in this way of existing in the world. Now, if you now use a technique which would take you into the underlying holotropic state, the experience that is trying to come through, you'll find out that you actually are drowning when you were 14 years ago, and you are dragging that situation to here. So the choking belongs to a different system of time-space coordinates. You're living in two places and two different time frameworks at the same time. You're mixing those two. And then you find that deeper behind it, that you're really stuck in the birth canal. You feel sort of still more in the birth canal than you feel here. And behind it, there could be an experience of being hanged somewhere. So there are bits of pieces of yourself that you left somewhere else that really didn't make it. You're not fully in this situation, and those states are trying to come into your present consciousness and sort of complete themselves. So the overlap here would be the situation that you want to stay away from. If you have this, the idea is to create a situation where you can go fully into this, find out what it is, experience it, then it takes you automatically back to the ordinary reality, and the enclave will not be there. It sort of fully express itself. So what you get here now is a kind of dynamic tension. Something in the holotropic is coming back to holotropic, and the holotropic is trying to go back to the holotropic, which is basically an expression of those two movements that we were talking about, from Satchitananda into creation and from creation back. So we are this kind of battlefield, and when those two modes of consciousness get mixed up, we experience them both together. That's what we call then psychopathology. If you can get it in a pure form, it is an authentic form of consciousness that's behind it. It is not a distortion of this one. If you see this one as just the only authentic, the only legitimate one, then anything that comes, whether it comes in this form, will be seen as pathology, as something that doesn't belong. But if you have context to experiment with this mode, you will find out that they are legitimate experiences of a different kind. There's nothing wrong with either of those, but you don't want to experience them simultaneously. So I think this is all we can do in the time that we had.
Okay.